Good evening, Shavua Tov, a good vach. It's great to be learning with you on a Saturday night, starting the week off with some beautiful learning. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Guy in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy, North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Missouri, Karen in Northern California, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn. Let's get started. Our daf tonight is page 33 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 3. We're picking this up pretty close to the top of page 32b. Apropos the question of whether partial entry into the temple courtyard is considered entry, and this is in keeping with the discussion we've been having, which includes the need to define minimum measures, minimum points of contact. In other words, what is eating, right? In certain contexts, if you eat less than an olive bulk, a ketzayis, then you haven't really eaten. And you have to eat that olive bulk within the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, as that size of bread was defined in Talmudic times, or it's not eating, it's just nibbling, it's something else. Likewise, if we're saying that, a priest is disqualified if he is tamei, but now we're talking about a person can be the one who slaughters an offering, even if he's not a priest, but a priest has to be the one who collects the blood, etc. And then there's a question of, an unfit person cannot enter the temple courtyard. Well, what if only a piece of him is in the temple courtyard? He's reaching in to the temple courtyard. Has he actually entered the temple courtyard? Is it going to disqualify? Is it going to satisfy these minimum measures? These kinds of questions. So about entry into the temple courtyard, right? A tamei person, somebody who's ritually impure, cannot enter the temple courtyard. And what we're talking about here is a priest. So a priest does not have to do the shechting, the slaughtering of an offering. A priest does have to do the collecting the blood, conveying it to the altar, and sprinkling it on the altar. But this Mishna here at the beginning of chapter 3 says that the shechting doesn't have to be done by a priest. It can be done by a woman. It can be done by a slave. It can be done by a person who's tamei, ritually impure. Well, a ritually impure person cannot enter the courtyard. The slaughtering has to be done in the courtyard. So what is the situation where a tamei person would be doing the slaughtering? Well, if he could reach in, and just his hand be in and do the slaughtering, then maybe he could accomplish that. But if his hand being in the courtyard is tantamount to entry, then there's no situation in which it would happen. So that's what they're examining. So Ula says that Reish Lakish says a tamei person who inserted his hand inside the temple courtyard is flogged for transgressing the prohibition of entering the temple while impure. Right? Actual flogging would happen if he was doing it intentionally and he'd been warned and he did it anyway, etc. But the point is that flogging would apply to somebody who only reached into the courtyard with his hand while he was tamei. So it sounds like he's entering, and therefore, how could he ever do the slaughtering? How do we know this? As it is stated with regard to the impurity of a woman who gave birth. This is just, remember, the Torah does not specify every element and every consequence of every action. So there's a lot of things that tamei people can't do. And so we learn out from various, examples of a person who is tamei, what they can and can't do in the Torah, to other situations where a tamei person, right? A man is not going to be tamei, in a situation where he gave birth. I know in the modern world there's other kinds of questions related to this, but we're just talking about in traditional context. So only women give birth, and yet what a man can and can't do will look to the law of a woman who's given birth and is tamei. A woman is just tamei after giving birth for a certain number of days, depending on whether it was a male or female child. And we can learn out from what the Torah says about a woman tamei from giving birth and what she can or cannot do to other areas of the law. So, as it is stated with regard to the tuma of a woman who gave birth, quote, every consecrated item she shall not touch, right? Because people who are tamei can't touch consecrated items. And to the temple she shall not come until the days of her purification are complete. Leviticus 12:4. Now the verse juxtaposes entry into the courtyard to touching a sacred item. And just as touching with even a part of the body, any part of the body is considered touching, so too entry with part of the body is considered entry, right? So since it's making a juxtaposition between entering the courtyard and touching sacred things, and if you're tamei, you can't touch a sacred thing with any part of your body, therefore no part of your body can enter the temple courtyard according to this interpretation. So Rav Hoshaya raised an objection to Ula's analysis from that which was taught in a baraisa. There is the case of a metzora, right? A metzora is somebody who has tzoras. Tzoras is that physical manifestation of a spiritual malady which no longer exists since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. But it used to exist. It was kind of an outbreak on the skin, very specific. It would have to require a priest who's an expert in the lesions of tzoras to come and declare that that person is a metzora. If a person becomes a metzora, they have to quarantine themselves from the rest of Klal Yisrael, of the people, until the tzoras passes. Then they're declared clean, and then they go through a purification ritual that includes bringing offerings. So there is the case of a metzora whose 8th day, on which he becomes tahor, ritually pure, from his tzoras, and performs the final stages of his purification process. Well, what if the 8th day of his purification process, when he would otherwise be done and just wait till nightfall and then he's pure again, but what if that 8th day happens to be Erev Pesach? Right? Erev Pesach is the day in the afternoon, especially before Pesach, Passover begins that night, which, when the temple was standing, was the time when the Pesach was slaughtered, right? The Passover lamb or goat, which then would be eaten on Passover night. And a person who is tamei cannot eat the Pesach. So, but this guy was basically done. He has been purified. He's just waiting for nightfall to come. So in that situation, I think he can have the Pesach slaughtered for him, and he can eat it that night. But here, there's going to be one additional wrinkle. There is the case of a metzora whose 8th day, on which he becomes ritually pure from his tzoras and performs the final stages of his purification process, occurs on Erev Pesach, such that it would be possible to bring his offerings and be fit to partake of the Pesach that evening. But he experienced a seminal emission on that day before he performed the final stages of his purification process, and this renders him ritually impure and prohibited from entering the temple, which he would need to do to bring his offerings. Now he can't enter the temple because he had a seminal emission. Yeah, he had relations with his wife. Something happened. So he then immersed himself in the mikveh, which is what you just have to do to become purified of that. And the question is whether he may come to the gate of the temple courtyard, which is necessary to complete his purification process and terminate his status as a metzora. So the sages said, although any other individual who was tamei and who immersed that day and is waiting for nightfall for the purification process to be completed, may not enter the temple, because even though he's done everything else of his purification, he still has to await nightfall. That hasn't come yet, so he can't enter the temple courtyard. But there is an exception made for this one. Although any other individual who is tamei, who immersed that day and is waiting for nightfall for the purification process to be completed, may not enter the temple mount until nightfall, this one may enter. And the reason is that it is better for a positive mitzvah that has a punishment of kares, i.e. the bringing of the Pesach, to come and override a positive mitzvah for which there is no liability to be punished with kares. You have competing positive mitzvahs here. A positive mitzvah means thou shalt do such and such. A negative mitzvah is thou shalt not do such and such. Well, doesn't it sound like the positive mitzvah is thou shalt bring the Pesach, right? Thou shalt eat the Passover lamb or the goat that night when the temple is standing. We don't do it anymore. And what's the other one? What's the competing mitzvah? Don't enter the temple when you're tamei. That sounds like a thou shalt not, lo aseh. Why are we saying positive mitzvah and positive mitzvah? The positive mitzvah is removing people who are tamei from the Temple Mount. Okay, so, and that sounds like, well, a person who is tamei and enters subject to lashes, right? We just said it before, flogging. Not bringing the Pesach when you're supposed to bring the Pesach, if you intentionally neglect to do that and you have no other disqualifying factors, you could be subject to kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court. So, bringing the Pesach should override not entering the Temple Mount when you're tamei, but only under specific circumstances. So let's keep reading. The reason is that it is better for a positive mitzvah that has kares to come and override a positive mitzvah for which there is no kares, i.e. the mitzvah to remove individuals who are tamei from the temple courtyard, than to have the positive mitzvah that has a punishment for kares not be performed, i.e. the Pesach. So, Rabbi Yochanan says, by Torah law, there is not even a positive mitzvah that restricts from entering the temple courtyard one who has immersed that day and will become pure only upon nightfall. As it is stated, quote, and Jehoshaphat stood in the congregation of Judea and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new courtyard. What does this have to do with positive and negative mitzvahs? That's 2 Chronicles 20, verse 5. Well, what is the meaning of the new courtyard? Rabbi Yochanan says this is referring to the place in which they innovated many matters and said that one who immersed that day may not enter the camp of the Levites, which in Jerusalem includes the entire Temple Mount, as opposed to in the Midbar, in the wilderness, right? There was the camp of the Israelites, the whole encampment, then the camp of the Levites, which was in the center, and then the Mishkan itself. So when the temple was built in Jerusalem, we translated the encampment of the Israelite people as all of Jerusalem, the Levite encampment as the Temple Mount, and the Mishkan as the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple itself. So they said that one who has gone through a purification process and needs to await nightfall to become fully purified can't enter the Temple Mount. That sounds like a rabbinic decree, which a Torah law can come and override. So let's see. This is referring to the place in which they innovated many matters and said that one who immersed that day may not enter the camp of the Levites, which in Jerusalem includes the entire Temple Mount. And this indicates that the prohibition is of rabbinic origin, and by Torah law, it is permitted for him to enter. So Rav Hoshaya now concludes his objection to Ula. And if you say that partial entry into the courtyard is considered entry, how does the metzora, who immersed himself that day, insert his hands into the courtyard so that his right thumb and his big toe will become purified, which is just part of the process the purification of metzora includes that the priest has to, I don't even know what, put some waters or libation. I can't remember right now. But basically has to touch the guy's thumb and big toe. Those can enter the courtyard in order to be purified, but not the rest of him, since he's still tamei. But he still has to have his right thumb and big toe, addressed by the priest so that he can become purified. So in this situation, both this mitzvah to eat the Pesach and that mitzvah for an impure person to not enter the courtyard are each a positive mitzvah for which there is liability to be punished with kares. As someone who immersed himself that day who enters the temple courtyard is liable to be punished with kares. So Ula answered Rabbi Hoshaya by saying, a proof to my opinion can be brought from your own burden, i.e. from the question you yourself asked. A metzora is different, as the Torah permitted him to insert his right thumb and his big toe into the courtyard in order to become purified, despite the fact that he has not yet brought an atonement offering to complete the purification process. And since he was permitted to partially enter the courtyard for purification of his tzoras, he was also permitted with regard to his impurity due to his seminal emission, in our original case that we stated. Nevertheless, a partial entry into the courtyard is in fact considered an entry. It's just that in this situation, it doesn't apply. Just checking. Yes, sprinkle blood upon his hands, the big toe and the thumb. Right, so just to review what a metzora goes through, after his tzoras has healed, the metzora allows 7 days of purity to pass, immerses, and then comes to the temple on the 8th day, brings his offerings, and achieves atonement. Before sacrificing his offerings, the metzora is still considered to be lacking atonement. It is permitted for such a person to enter the Temple Mount, which is considered the Levite camp, but he is prohibited from entering the temple courtyard, which is considered the camp of the divine presence. The priest must sprinkle some blood of the metzora's guilt offering and oil. That's what I was not remembering. On the tip of the metzora's ear and on his right thumb and his big toe. And it must be done specifically inside the courtyard. Therefore, the metzora stands within the Nicanor gate, which is between the women's courtyard and the temple courtyard, and does not have the sanctity of the temple courtyard, and he inserts his hands within the courtyard so that the priest can sprinkle the blood upon them. Okay. Based on Ula's previous comment, Rav Yosef said Ula holds that if most of the Jewish people were Zavim on Erev Pesach and were therefore prohibited from sacrificing the Pesach because they are tamei, and then they became also tamei due to a corpse. And what's the difference, right? So a ziva, or person who's a zav, because he's had, 2 seminal emissions that are a gonorrhea-like discharge. So then he becomes impure as a zav. Then he can't enter the temple courtyard, can't bring offerings. If most of the population of Israel, and a woman can have it if she has irregular bleeding outside her normal cycle. So if most of the population were zavim, they still can't bring offerings. As opposed to if most of the population became tamei through corpse tuma, let's say, God forbid, there was some huge epidemic or there was a huge war and everybody was involved in burying the bodies, and more than half of the people were tamei by virtue of corpse tuma, then they could still bring communal offerings, and I think even bring the Pesach. So they could override the restriction on tuma if the majority of the population is tamei by virtue of corpse tuma. But they can't override that prohibition if it's a different kind of tuma, like being a zav. So what they're asking here is, well, the majority were tamei as zavim, so they can't override that prohibition, but then they also became tamei as through corpse tuma. So now can this second instance of being tamei come and override the prohibition if they were already not allowed to override the restriction because the majority were zavim? So let's see what happens then. Rav Yosef said Ula holds that if most of the Jewish people were zavim on Erev Pesach and were therefore prohibited from sacrificing the Pesach while impure, and then they became tamei due to a corpse, which allows them to sacrifice the Pesach despite their tuma, as they are a majority of the Jewish people, since they are permitted to sacrifice the offering with regard to their tuma due to a corpse, they are also permitted with regard to their ziva. So even though they couldn't override that prohibition as zavim, now that they can override it because they're tamei by virtue of a corpse, their other tuma gets disregarded. So Abaye said to him, are these cases comparable? With regard to a metzora who also experiences a seminal emission, he was already permitted to partially enter the courtyard despite his tuma, because of that exception for the metzora coming to the end of his tuma. And so he can insert his hand, become fully purified, and bring the Pesach that night. There was an existing exception for him. Therefore, the subsequent tuma does not prohibit him from entering. By contrast, the Zevachim were originally prevented from sacrificing the Pesach. Therefore, even if he would be permitted to enter the courtyard despite being tamei due to a corpse, he would not be permitted to enter due to the ziva that was previously present. Right? If he had a no followed by a yes, the yes doesn't let him in. If he had a yes followed by a no, then the no doesn't prevent him from going in. Furthermore, Abaye said to him, perhaps this is what the master is saying. If most of the Jewish people were initially tamei due to a corpse, and they subsequently became Zevachim, since they are permitted with regard to their tuma from the corpse, they are permitted with regard to their ziva as well. And Rav Yosef said to him, yes, that is what I meant. So the Gemara asks, but still, this is not comparable to the case of Ula, since with regard to a metzora, it is with total permission that he is allowed partial entry into the courtyard. And since it was permitted with regard to one impurity, it was permitted with regard to a second impurity. But the tuma, with regard to the sacrificing of the Pesach, is only overridden, not erased. And there is not, therefore, a total permission. So perhaps with regard to this, i.e. corpse tuma, it is overridden. But with regard to that, ziva tuma, it is not overridden. So Rav has said to him, on the contrary, the opposite is more reasonable. With regard to a metzora, it is with specific permission that he is allowed by the Torah to insert his right thumb and his big toe into the courtyard in order to become purified, despite his tuma, which was not granted for other types of tuma. Therefore, perhaps only with regard to this tuma is it permitted, but with regard to that tuma, the seminal emission, it is not permitted. But with regard to tuma, generally, since it is overridden in the case of tuma, the prohibition on a tamei person entering the courtyard, since that is overridden in the case of tuma from a corpse, and the majority of the Jewish people having it, what difference does it make to me if there is one tuma that is overridden or if there is two tumas that are overridden? Now we're on page 33a. The Gemara comments, it can be derived by inference that both Abaye and Rava hold that impurity is overridden in cases involving the public, and it is not entirely permitted. We override because a majority of the public needs to bring that offering, but we don't erase the prohibition. The Gemara returns to discussing Ula's statement that partial entry of a tamei individual is considered entry. That's the question we were examining. Are we going to say that somebody who is tamei and inserts his hand into the courtyard has entered the courtyard? Let us say that a baraisa supports Ula's opinion concerning all the cases of placing hands, right? Placing hands means smicha, placing your hands on an offering that's going to be brought before it is slaughtered. Concerning all cases of smicha that were in the temple, I say about them that the principle immediately following the smicha is the shechting, the slaughter, right? Right after the individual bringing the offering puts his hands on the animal that's going to be slaughtered, then it's slaughtered. One has to follow the other, meaning that these acts must take place uninterruptedly and in the same location. The shechting, the slaughtering, has to be done in the courtyard. Therefore, the smicha has to be done in the courtyard. Can a tamei person do smicha? Well, it's going to be the same question, right? Can he stick his hands into the courtyard on the animal without himself being in the courtyard? If that is possible, it would seem that partial entry, just the hands being in the courtyard, is not considered entry of a tamei person in the courtyard. Let's see. And this is so, except for this case of the metzora, who places his hands on the guilt offering, which was done in the threshold of the Nicanor gate and not in the temple courtyard, where the guilt offering was slaughtered. And the reason for this is that a metzora cannot enter the courtyard until they sprinkle from the blood of his sin offering and from the blood of his guilt offering on the altar on his behalf. He has not achieved atonement, and therefore he has not achieved purification until the blood of his offerings is sprinkled on the altar. Therefore, he's not tamei. Therefore, he can't enter. And the Gemara explains the proof. And if you say that partial entry is not considered entry, so let him insert his hands and place them on the head of the offering. And the offering should then be slaughtered in that location next to the gate. Not at the Nicanor gate, but actually in the courtyard. Rav Yosef said, no, that proof doesn't work. Because there is no proof from here, as in accordance with whose opinion is this Baraisa? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. And what does he say? He says that the northern side of the courtyard, in which it is permitted to slaughter offerings of the most sacred order, like a sin offering, which includes also the guilt offering, includes only the area to the north of the altar and not the entire northern section of the courtyard. This area is far north of the entrance to the courtyard, i.e. more than 22 cubits away. Consequently, even if the metzora were to insert his hands into the courtyard and place them on the head of his guilt offering, it would not be permitted to slaughter it there. So the Gemara suggests, okay, wait a minute. But let an opening be made, and the word for opening here is pishpash. Great word. But let a pishpash be made in the northern courtyard wall facing the altar where the metzora can insert his hands. And the Gemara explains, Abaye and Rava both say that such a structural change cannot be made to the temple, since the verse states with regard to the temple construction, quote, all in writing, as the Lord has made me wise by his hand upon me, even all the works of this pattern, from 1 Chronicles 28:19, meaning the temple was built according to God's specifications, and we don't bring in interior designers to do a redesign. There are those who say that Rabbi Yosef said another explanation as to why a metzora cannot insert his hands into the courtyard and place them on the head of the offering. Anyone who places hands on the head of an offering must insert his head and most of his body into the courtyard. And what is the reason? We require placing hands with all his force. It's not you just reach over and put your hands on the animal's head. You have to lean on the animal when you're doing smicha. And that means that the person's head would be in the courtyard. And guess what? If not only your hands, but your head and your hands are in the courtyard, you're in the courtyard. That's not partial entry anymore. There are those who say that Rabbi Yosef said another explanation. Anyone who places his hands must insert his head and most of his body. And what is the reason? We require placing hands with all his force. Therefore, it is not possible for the metzora to perform the placing of his hands properly without entering the courtyard. And the placing of hands on the offering is done instead in the threshold of the Nicanor gate, which does not have the holiness of the courtyard itself. So the Gemara clarified, what does the Tana of the Baraisa hold? If he holds that placing hands on the head of a guilt offering of a metzora is by Torah law, and the principle that immediately following the placing of hands, the smicha, on the head of an offering must be its slaughter, is also by Torah law, well then let the metzora openly insert his hands into the courtyard and place them on the head of the offering, as the merciful one states in the Torah that he must do so. Rav Adam or Ratana says, in principle, yeah, that's what should be done. But the prohibition against the metzora entering the courtyard is a rabbinic decree, due to the concern that perhaps he will increase his steps, i.e. enter the courtyard more than is necessary, and be liable for entering there in a state of tamei. He is, when he's tamei, okay, there's this exception that the Torah itself makes so that he can finish his purification process, but he shouldn't be in the courtyard more than is necessary since he's tamei. There are those who say that Rav Ada bar Matana says that smicha, placing hands on the head of a guilt offering of a metzora, is indeed by Torah law, but the requirement that immediately following the placing of the hands must come the slaughter is not by Torah law. Therefore, he places his hands on the offering outside of the courtyard, and then they bring the animal in and slaughter it there. So the Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa cited previously on page 32a. The verse states, and he shall place his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and he shall slaughter the bull. That's Leviticus 1, verses 4 and 5. Now, what's this referring to? This is the Yom Kippur bull brought by the high priest as an atonement for his household. Nevertheless, we can learn about smicha and other matters that pertain to other people and other kinds of offerings. Just as smicha may be performed only by a person who is ritually pure, so too the slaughter may be performed only by ritually pure people. And if you say that the requirement that placing hands must immediately precede the slaughter is not by Torah law, then with regard to ritually impure individuals, you also find that placing hands may be performed since they can do so outside the courtyard. Right? It's not that smicha requires that a person be tahor. It's that smicha has to be done in the courtyard and a tamei person can't enter the courtyard. Is that what we're saying? Rather, reverse it and say that smicha on the guilt offering of a metzora is not by Torah law. And therefore, the metzora must do so outside the courtyard. But with regard to offerings that require smicha by Torah law, the requirement that immediately following the smicha must be the shechting, that's by Torah law. Now we're on page 33b. The Gemara returns to Ula's statement in the name of Reish Lakish that an impure individual, somebody who's tamei, and who inserted his hand into the temple courtyard is flogged because partial entry is considered entry. An objection was then raised from the case of the metzora, where he is not liable to be punished with kares for partial entry. And Ula offered one answer. Ravina says there's another answer. It was stated only with regard to lashes, teaching that one is flogged for partially entering the courtyard while he's tamei. Reish Lakish agrees that there is no punishment of kares for partial entry, as there is for full entry. So when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Rabbi Bachu says that the statement of Reish Lakish with regard to this verse was stated with regard to a tamei individual who touched sacrificial food, and not with regard to partial entry into the courtyard, as Ula had said. We're talking about different steps in the sacrificial process. What is sacrificial food? Sacrificial food generally refers to the part of a sin offering that priests eat, or presumably could also refer to the part of a peace offering that other people eat, but those are offerings of lesser sanctity. So does that, I'm not sure right now if a tamei person can eat from a peace offering outside the temple courtyard. Probably not, but definitely not a priest who is tamei. He can't eat from a sin offering. In fact, he can't be on the Temple Mount. So maybe it's eating from sacrificial offerings that this law really pertains to, and not just entering the Temple Mount. And this is, as it was stated, there is a dispute among the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara period, as opposed to the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishna, the earlier Mishnaic period. There is an Amoraic dispute with regard to a tamei person who touched sacrificial food. So Reish Lakish says he is flogged. Rabbi Yochanan says he is not flogged. And the Gemara elaborates, Reish Lakish says he is flogged, as it is written, every consecrated item she shall not touch, right, about the woman who gave birth. And Rabbi Yochanan says he is not flogged, as that verse is written with regard to touching the portion of the produce designated for the priest, teruma, not necessarily other kinds of not necessarily sacrificial food. Teruma is not a sacrificial food. It's consecrated, but it's part of the tithing process that is given to priests. Only they can eat it. They have to be tahor, and the food has to be tahor. But even though that's true, that's different than sacrificial food. Gemara asks, but does Reish Lakish actually hold that this verse comes to teach this law? He requires this verse to teach something else entirely, a prohibition for a tamei person who eats sacrificial meat. As it was stated, from where is the prohibition for a tamei person who eats sacrificial meat derived? Reish Lakish says it is derived from the verse, every consecrated item she shall not touch, which the Gemara will explain is referring to eating, not touching. Rabbi Yochanan says Bardella teaches that this prohibition is derived from a verbal analogy of the term his impurity, tumato, written with regard to one who eats sacrificial meat while tamei, and the term his impurity, tumato, written with regard to one who enters the temple while he is tamei. So just as there with regard to entering the temple while tamei, the Torah prescribed the punishment of kares, and also explicitly prohibited doing it, entering the temple while tamei, so too here, with regard to eating sacrificial meat while tamei, the Torah prescribed the punishment of kares, and also explicitly prohibited doing it. So clearly, Reish Lakish understood this verse as referring to eating sacrificial meat, not merely touching it. So the Gemara answers that Reish Lakish holds that both can be derived from Leviticus 12:4 about the woman who gave birth, not touching consecrated things. The prohibition with regard to a tamei individual who touched sacrificial food is derived from the fact that the merciful one expressed this prohibition with the term of touching, not eating, while the prohibition with regard to one who eats sacrificial food while tamei is derived from the fact that the Torah juxtaposed the prohibition of eating sacrificial food while tamei to the prohibition of entering the temple while tamei in the verse, every consecrated item she shall not touch, and to the temple she shall not come. So the Gemara comments, it is taught in the Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish. It is written, every consecrated item she shall not touch. This is a prohibition for a tamei person who eats sacrificial food. Do you say that it is a prohibition for a tamei person who eats sacrificial food? Or perhaps it is only a prohibition for a tamei person who touches sacrificial food? That would be more stringent than eating, right? Touching is, less substantive than eating it. The verse states, every consecrated item she shall not touch, and to the temple she shall not come. The verse juxtaposes the matter pertaining to sacrificial food to the matter of entering the temple while ritually impure. And just as entering the temple is a matter that entails a punishment that involves the taking of a life, kares, so too the matter pertaining to sacrificial food entails a punishment that involves the taking of a life, kares. So the Gemara explains, and if the prohibition is with regard to touching a sacrificial food, is there a punishment that entails the taking of a life? Rather, that prohibition is with regard to eating sacrificial foods while tamei, kares. Touching sacrificial foods while tamei, maybe only flogging, not kares. We're on page 34a. The Gemara asks, but this verse is still necessary for Reish Lakish to teach the law of a ritually impure person who ate sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood of the offering on the altar when the meat is not yet permitted. As it was stated, with regard to a tamei individual who ate sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood, Reish Lakish says he is flogged for doing it, and Rabbi Yochanan says he is not flogged. Reish Lakish gives his point. He is flogged, as it is written, every consecrated item she shall not touch, without limiting the prohibition to a specific time, indicating that it is no different if one eats that sacrificial meat prior to the sprinkling of the blood, and it is no different if one does so after the sprinkling of the blood. Why would that make a difference? Because if he wasn't tamei and he was going to be permitted to eat the meat, he still couldn't eat it before the blood was sprinkled. Right, that the time for eating sacrificial meat is only after the blood has been sprinkled. So this would be a case of a double infraction, right? Both being tamei when he ate it and eating it before sprinkling. Does that result in flogging or not? Reish Lakish says, yes, he's still flogged. Rabbi Yochanan says he is not flogged, as the sage Bardella teaches that the prohibition is derived by means of the verbal analogy cited before us. The verse states, his tumah, with regard to an impure person who eats sacrificial food, and states his tumah with regard to an impure person entering the temple. And when his tumah is written, it is with regard to partaking of sacrificial meat after the sprinkling of the blood, when it is appropriate to do so. So if he ate it prematurely, it's like he's not doing anything at all. Obviously, there's other problems here, but he's not going to qualify for flogging. The Gemara answers for Reish Lakish, if so, that the verse was referring only to partaking of the sacrificial meat after the sprinkling of the blood, let the verse say, a consecrated item she shall not touch. What is the reason for using the phrase, every consecrated item? Conclude two things from it, i.e. it also includes the prohibition on not eating sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. The Gemara discusses the matter itself. With regard to a tamei person who ate sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood, Reish Lakish says he is flogged for doing that. And Rabbi Yochanan says he is not flogged. Abaye says this dispute applies with regard to a case of tumah of the body of the one who eats the meat. But with regard to impurity of the flesh, i.e. the meat, if the meat was tamei, all agree that he is flogged, right? If the sacrificial meat, the part of a sin offering that is eaten by the priest, if it somehow became tamei, how would that happen? Like perhaps one of the priests, tragically had a heart attack and died. And when he died, he dropped dead, and his body came into contact with the portion of that sin offering that was meant to be eaten by the priest. Now the meat became tamei. Can the priests who were scheduled to eat that meat eat it? No. And if they did so knowingly, they could be flogged for that. Now that's distinguished from if the priest became tamei. Same situation, one of the priests in the Temple Mount dropped dead of a heart attack, didn't come into contact with the meat of the sin offering, rather he came into contact with one of the other priests. What does that other priest have to do? Get out. Like the horror movie. He has to get out, right? He can't eat the sacrificial meat because he's tamei. He can't even be on the Temple Mount because he's tamei. And this is as the verse states, and the flesh that touches any impure item shall not be eaten, it shall be burned with fire. And the flesh, every one that is pure may eat the flesh. The sages arrive that the extra term, and the flesh, serves to include wood and frankincense, which are not fit for consumption, and even so the verse included them as being susceptible to tuma. And one who eats them while he is impure is flogged. Therefore, sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood, which is fit for consumption, is certainly included in that prohibition. And Rava says this dispute applies with regard to a case of impurity of the body, but with regard to impurity of the meat, all agree that he is not flogged. And what is the reason? Since one does not apply to meat before the sprinkling of the blood, the verse, but the soul that eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of peace offerings of the Lord, having his impurity upon him, that soul shall be cut off from his people. So that answered my question before. A person who's tamei cannot eat from peace offerings, even though that's not limited to priests. That's just the owner of the peace offering can eat of it and share it with his friends. But he and his friends need to be tahor. When can they eat it? Only after the blood of the peace offering is sprinkled on the altar. But this verse, right, that said that one who eats of peace offerings cannot be impure, this is referring to meat after the sprinkling of the blood, and so too one does not apply to it the prohibition, the flesh that touches any impure item shall not be eaten. So the Gemara challenges the statement of Rava. But doesn't the master say that the term and the flesh serves to include wood and frankincense that became impure as items that are forbidden to be eaten, despite the fact that they are not fit for consumption? Certainly then, sacrificial flesh before the sprinkling of the blood, which is not fit for consumption because the blood hasn't been sprinkled, should also be included in the category of items forbidden to be eaten. And the Gemara answers, what are we dealing with here that one would be liable for eating wood and frankincense that are impure? It is a case where the wood and the frankincense were sanctified in a vessel, and the reason for the liability is that they are then considered like an item for which all of its permitting factors were sacrificed, such as the flesh, after the sprinkling of the blood, and only then is one liable for eating it while impure. And this is as we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Meila, page 10a, with regard to anything that has permitting factors, i.e., portions of the ritual that must be performed or items that must be sacrificed before the meat of the offering may be eaten. For example, the meat of an offering that is permitted to be eaten only after the sprinkling of the blood. So one is liable for eating it while he is tamei from the time that its permitting factors were sacrificed, right? So if he is both tamei and eating it before the sprinkling, it's like a double negative that ends up being a nothing burger, right? Because he wasn't allowed to eat it anyway. So the fact that he was tamei while he ate it, again, two things were done wrong. He shouldn't have done it for sure, but he's not going to qualify for flogging. With regard to anything that does not have permitting factors, such as the handful removed from a meal offering and the frankincense, which themselves render the rest of the meal offering permitted for consumption, one is liable for eating it while impure from the time that it is sanctified in a vessel. It's not waiting for some other permitting factor to render it suitable for eating. Okay, just one comment from Sharon. Since the Pesach offerings are for a group, what happened if the person doing the offerings is tamei but does not inform the priest? Is that Pesach ineligible for the rest of the group as well? So I'm trying to follow what the situation you're creating, right? So when the temple was standing, right, a group would have prearranged to be bringing a Pesach together, a lamb or a goat. They're gonna, set up their little barbecue camp. One of them is going to take the animal, living, right, up to the temple. There it's going to be slaughtered. Its blood is going to be sprinkled. And then he's going to bring it back to the group. And now they're going to roast it in the way that the Pesach needs to be roasted. And they're all going to eat it that night. And usually a peace offering accompanies it because maybe there's not enough meat in the whole, for that whole group to be satisfied from a small lamb. So are you saying the priest who brings the offerings? I don't think so, because you said what happened to the person doing the offerings is tamei, but does not inform the priest. So I guess you're talking about the one who brings the lamb to the temple. So he's tamei. He should not be participating in this, right? So you're saying, okay, but he either didn't know or didn't tell. And then later they find out that he was tamei when that offering was brought. So I think that when we talk about majorities allowing the offerings to be brought, it's majority of the Jewish people, not just majority of a group. So I don't think that part of it applies. So we're just saying that this guy who's not supposed to be participating is the one who brought the animal up to the Temple Mount. I'm not sure that he disqualified the rest of his group, but if he carried, right, the slaughtered animal back from the temple to his group, and only later they realized he was tamei, I think now he rendered that Pesach inedible. I think that would be my impression. Obviously I'm no expert in this. I'm just answering off the top of my head, but that would be my impression on that, subject to further research. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Way to start the week off with some beautiful and difficult learning on a Saturday night. Good Vach, Shavua Tov.